first, into mentioning why Jane and I wear our robes. We recently, this is something we've done before, something that emerged recently, but we're recently reading a book by a good friend of ours on performance and art. And in my writings, I'm very critical of the idea that we tend to separate dimensions of ourselves, okay? What we should understand is that it's not that there basically is a world in which there are us and then there are arts. We actually are the manifestations of art, technology, etc. And within that framework, the rituals we take on are highly important because they exemplify the extent to which we bring meaning into the world. And some of you may not be aware of this, but the context of what created what we call universities, although it has a rather pernicious history in terms of colonialism, it also has a more complex history in terms of understanding that it came out of communities of priests, clergy. And within that framework, the idea was that knowledge is sacred. And so it's sacramental. In wearing our robes, it's a way for Jane and me to say to you that we consider the privilege, the honor of engaging you, of addressing you as a sacred one. And you may have noticed that when the chancellor was being examined, there was the question about truth. And when you are asked about your learning, truth also is brought up. Within this context, truth is understood as sacred. So we wear our robes, those you have entrusted to endow you with the legitimacy of what we have to offer, we're also acknowledging its sacramental dimension and that it is sacred. Additionally, we should bear in mind that as we get together, the sacred is connected to ancestors and descendants. And it is with that in mind, I like to read something for you. I like to read this whenever I speak, not only at commencements, but just generally, mainly because it's very important for us to understand how we're connected to those from long ago. And so I'm going to read something. This is something that was written 4,000 years ago. And this is the statement. It was by a fellow by the name of Antef. And Antef wrote, "The seeker of wisdom is the one whose heart is informed about these things which would be otherwise ignored. The one who is clear-sighted when he or she is deep into a problem. The one who is moderate in his or her actions, who penetrates ancient writings." And boy, think about that, right? That's 4,000 years ago, and Antef is talking about ancient writings. So you could see we're part of a very long tradition. "Whose advice is sought to unravel complications, who is really wise, who instructed his or her own heart, who stays awake at night as he or she looks for the right paths, who surpasses what he or she accomplished yesterday, who is wiser than a sage, who brought himself or herself to wisdom, who asks for advice and sees to it that he or she is asked advice." And by the way, when you hear the himself or herself in that, when I read out the quote, that's my translation, because back then in many languages, the gendered terms are not the way we use them in English, but what they mean by that is all humanity. So I made that that addition. Now, one of the things about what has brought you to here today is education. And when we think about education, it's very important for you to understand that education raises a profound conundrum. And the profound conundrum is talked about, I brought up the sacred, in many myths, in many societies. For instance, in Islam, this conundrum is talked about in the distinction between, Baha and Insan. But some of us know this distinction through Simone de Beauvoir, and we know this also through a varieties of other texts. But Simone de Beauvoir put it elegantly this way: you're born human and then you spend the rest of your life trying to become one. And that's the paradox of our existence. This becoming, that stuff that Antef talked about, that becoming is why we engage in education. And there's a second dimension of this, because you see that becoming is a form of empowerment. And empowerment is a very important concept, because often when we talk about power, today there's a tendency to talk about power in the negative, in coercive ways, in destructive ways. But the reality is that without power, you can't do anything. Power is the ability to make things happen with the conditions of doing so. If you did not have the power to get up this morning, if you didn't have your arms, your legs, or some way, if you didn't have arms or legs, you wouldn't be able to do anything. And when I said the conditions of doing so, well, many of you in choosing to join us with GCAS have made a decision that you needed a condition. And that condition is why we're here today, because this condition of your degree, this condition now puts you in a framework, a context, and a variety of other situations to make things happen. So as we see our tasks here, we see ourselves as having the great joy, the privilege, the honor of empowering you, and empowering you to do what? To empower others. Now, this is a difficult task because, as we know, we're in difficult times. Our difficult times right now is one in which many are not only searching for a breath of fresh air, but it's also the times in which we are dealing with a profound level of nihilism and despair. And this is mainly because those who use power coercively don't want the rest of us to understand that ultimately we need one another to build a world worth living in. If we collapse into despair, we just become instruments of an ongoing system that consumes us. And so it becomes important for institutions not only like GCAS, but the many institutions many of you create, because you see, when we select our students, we don't simply say, oh, you want a degree, come to GCAS. What we look for are people who understand that ultimately they are also creating institutions, works of art, works of ideas, works that ultimately play an important role in cultivating dignity and freedom. In short, you are already engaged in the task of empowering others through setting conditions for them to be able to do what can make things happen. Now, there are many allegories about how we do so, but one I love to tell is a story about many years ago when I gave a lecture in South Africa. I was giving, I go to South Africa all the time, but what happened one day was I usually try to show up early. And when I show up, there's a piano. And I'm a bit miffed because these days, when you go to speak at places, there aren't pianos around. Before, there were always pianos or some kind of instrument. And of late, as a drummer, I've had to be using podiums, or as you can see right now, this table. But I also play piano. And when I set out to play the piano, my hosts ran over and said, it's not tuned. I said, don't worry. So I played the untuned piano. And as the audience gathered at the end, they enjoyed the music and they clapped. And my hosts went over and they scratched their heads and they said, we thought it wasn't tuned. And I looked at them and I said, it isn't tuned. They said, you know, you can make music with an untuned instrument. Now, why do I tell this story? Well, I tell this story because it connects to part of what your GCAS education is about. Because you see, our goal wasn't to make you into clones of us. Our goal wasn't to make you a person who will only make music if only a small set of conditions were there. The idea is for you to make music and to make music in your voice, in your way. And so you bring something to it. All I had to do that day was simply play the piano differently. And if we think about this in terms of humanity today, what colonialism, racism, sexism, and the many isms have done is to try to tune you in such a way that there could only be one kind of music. But part of the task of liberation, of freedom, is to open the possibilities to playing music in such a way that we can hear in different meters, learn all of those missing tones, the quarter tones, the eighth tones, the different tones. And with all of that, begin to bring to the world a situation in which real democracy, for instance, can happen. Because all of those people out there who are being crushed or put down in terms of the claim that they're out of tune, it is up to us to remind the world that they could also make music. We need right now to make our planet groove. So I'm going to close with some advice. The first one is that you should remember what made you fall in love with learning. You see, because there are people who are more interested simply in the certification, but not the education. But when you're in love with learning, you continue to learn. And in fact, the faculty of GCAS are really advanced students. What we are people who fell in love with learning so much. We continue to learn, to study. That's what our books, our performances are about. And we love it so much that we love learning with you. And as you have joined us in this love of learning, we encourage you to take it out there and remember what made you fall in love with learning in the first place. So write a personal letter to yourself that reminds you of what made you fall in love with learning and continually revisit it. Additionally, think through some important virtues. Among them is wonder, curiosity, truth, and courage. Now, courage is something that you always face because a lot of you are independent, creative people, but you're not obnoxious, malignant narcissists. And what I mean by this is that you're not saying you always have it right, but to be able to be a courageous person, you need to be able to admit when others have it right. And there are times when you see that deep in your gut, what is right, it means you're willing also to take on the difficulties you will face by speaking truth. And this difficulty can be carried with you through life, through remembering love. So I thank you for joining us on this journey. I thank you for your commitment and your fortitude. And I also would like to say this to you. The thing about GCAS is a place of firsts. There are so many of you, because of your creativity, who are the first to be doing X, Y, or Z. A lot of our faculty are firsts. But you know that thing I said about love? You know that thing I said about courage? That requires you understanding that being a first carries with it an enormous responsibility not to be the last. GCAS exists because none of us want to be the last. And we would like you then to join us in making this continue. So it's with that I say to you, Aluta Continua, which is from the Mozambican Revolution, for the struggle continues. But I also say in the ancient language of Meru Neter, Dua Niter, which is the same as Mazel Tov. And it means, I congratulate you with blessings. Thank you.